Doctrine and Covenants 81 through 83. Imagine taking a road trip with no set map to follow, just a handful of people trying to figure out the road in real time. That's what it was like in the early days of the church. But in this week's sections, Doctrine and Covenants 81 through 83, we watch the church begin to grow up, with leadership being defined, with organizations taking shape, and even tricky legal questions being answered. This is a coming-of-age moment for the church, so let's dive in. 2 years after the church was restored, leadership was still a little fuzzy. Joseph Smith was the prophet, Edward Partridge was the bishop in Missouri, and Newell K. Whitney was the bishop in Ohio. But other than that, there was no formal support organization for Joseph Smith. There was no first presidency, no Quorum of the 12, no clear structure. Now that all starts to change with Section 81. On what was likely a cold and windy March day, Joseph Smith received a revelation calling Sidney Rigdon and Jesse Gause as his counselors, officially forming the first presidency. For Joseph, this must have been a huge relief. Now he didn't have to carry the weight of every major decision alone. Sidney Rigdon had already been a loyal helper since his conversion. Jesse Gause was a newer member, a former Shaker and a friend of Joseph's. For 9 months, Jesse was all in. He helped form the United Firm, worked on the Bible translation. He went on a mission. But when he tried to convince his wife Minerva to join the church, she refused, and he was determined to stay loyal to her. What happened next is kind of a mystery, but by December, Jesse had left the church and disappeared from the records. That's why in your copy of Doctrine and Covenants 81, Jesse's name is gone, literally crossed out in the original and replaced with Frederick G. Williams. Even in its growing pains, the church was learning how to adapt and keep moving forward. As the Lord continued to expand his church, the pace picked up, and so did the opposition. The church was growing up, and like any maturing body of believers, it wasn't just organizational changes happening. The cost of discipleship was getting higher. Between the revelations in Doctrine and Covenants 81 and 82, things in Ohio took a very dark turn. Not long after bearing his own newborn twins, Joseph and Emma had adopted the motherless Murdoch twins. One night, as Joseph took the night shift with one of the infants, both of whom were sick with the measles, a mob of men broke into the Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio. They dragged Joseph outside, tore off his clothes, choked him until he passed out, beat him, and covered him in tar and feathers. One man even tried to pour poison into his mouth. But perhaps the most heartbreaking thing Joseph heard that night, between the blasphemous oaths and plans to kill him, was the name of Simons being called over and over between the mob members. Joseph knew that name. Simon's Ryder had been a member of the church not long before, and now here he was, part of a mob trying to kill Joseph. And yet, after painfully making his way home when the attack ended and spending the night in excruciating pain as his friends removed the tar from his body, Joseph dressed in the morning and preached a sermon to the congregation as usual, with his attacker, Simon's Ryder, and other mob members in attendance. That same day, he baptized 3 people. After the mob had broken into Joseph's home, the house door had been left open, and the cold air that blew in was too much for one of the already sick babies who died from the exposure. And Sidney Rigdon, who had also been attacked but was dragged by his heels, suffered a severe concussion and temporary mental instability that some people believed affected him the rest of his life. It was becoming quite obvious that Joseph and his family's safety was at risk in Ohio. So within days, Joseph left Hiram, Ohio, and began the long, dangerous journey to Missouri to fulfill the Lord's command. He wrote to Emma, urging her to relocate for her safety. Along Joseph's route with his companions, their boat caught or was set on fire twice, and mobs kept trying to follow them. Still, Joseph pushed forward. Just weeks later, Joseph, Sidney, and Newell K. Whitney arrived in Independence, Missouri. They were fulfilling the command to organize the United Firm, an early church business organization, kind of like a spiritual LLC. But even away from the mobs in Ohio, things weren't perfect in Zion. Bishop Partridge and Sidney Rigdon had been holding a grudge for months over disagreements about where to build the temple. Even though they'd recently made amends, the disagreements had created a feeling of discord. On April 26, during a leadership conference, Joseph received Section 82, and the Lord forgave them both. This section also answered a question that had been bothering the saints. Where was church headquarters? Missouri might be Zion, but most of the church leadership, including Joseph, lived in Ohio. But here the saints were given a clear answer. Independence was Zion, or in other words, church headquarters, and Kirtland was to be a stake to Zion. Section 82 also gave more details about how the United Firm would work. Each member would be assigned a stewardship, basically a part of the church's business, and would share resources. The goal was to generate a financial surplus to fund the Lord's work and to care for the poor. Even though the United Firm's initial membership and efforts were modest, it laid the foundation for the church's modern self-reliant systems. A few days later, Joseph left Independence and traveled 12 miles west to visit church members in some of the small frontier settlements like Gause Township. As he visited among them, one big issue kept coming up. What happens to a family's property if the husband dies? Missouri law was not kind to widows. A woman didn't automatically inherit land when her husband died. And if he'd consecrated that land to the church, things got even messier. Joseph met with women like Phoebe Crosby Peck, a widow with 4 kids, and Anna Slade Rogers, who was raising a daughter alone. To these women, this wasn't just a hypothetical question, it was a very real and urgent concern. Joseph didn't have an immediate answer for the saints in these small settlements. But after he returned to Independence on April 30th, Joseph received Section 83, which clarified that widows and children do have claims to property and support. It was an early example of the Lord looking out for the vulnerable, and a step toward the welfare principles the church still follows today. These 3 sections, 81, 82, and 83, show the infant church shifting from a somewhat chaotic startup to a structured movement. And while it wasn't perfect, the saints kept building Zion, even while they were figuring out what that looked like. The church's growing up years were a little messy, just like ours. But through all the chaos, God was in charge and helped shape it into something marvelous. And He'll do the same for us. And that's what's happening in Come Follow Me this week. Giveaway announcement. Hey, make sure that you are subscribed to this channel because for the rest of 2025, from July through December, I am going to be giving away a $50 Amazon gift card to one subscriber every single month. So make sure to hit that subscribe button. Like and subscribe so that YouTube will share these videos with more people. And check out the Start Here app for daily Come Follow Me study prompts.